On Friday the 27th of November 1987, something happened in Noosa Heads, Australia that would forever impact generations of the community and leave so many of them reeling to this day. At around 4:30 that afternoon, a young girl jumped on her bicycle and started heading off towards her home. She was 12-year-old Sian Kingi, a schoolgirl originally from New Zealand and of Maori descent. She was known to be a rather shy and quiet girl, but she was also known for her love of dance and for her smile that could light up a room. And on that evening, she'd actually been with her mother. They'd met up at a grocery store where Shan helped her mother do the shopping and pack the car, but Shan had ridden her bicycle to school that day, and with the groceries in the trunk, there wasn't enough space to fit Shan's bicycle in as well. Rather than leave her bicycle at the store, Shan decided that she would ride it back and meet her mother at home, and her mother agreed to this. After all, Shan usually rode her bike to and from school, so she knew the streets well, and her mother trusted her not to get into any trouble, so they parted ways. Shan's mother said goodbye to her daughter, got in her car and went on her way. And Shan hopped on her bike and took off, but it wasn't a surprise to Shan's mother when she made it home before her daughter did. At first, her mother thought that it was because Shan was biking and it was going to take her a little longer to make it back. But then her mother had thought about the route in which Shan would be taking from the grocery store. She thought it was possible that Shan had bumped into some friends from school or even from her volleyball team. Her mother didn't panic, but as time went by, she started to get the feeling that something was off, and she began to call Shan's friends to see if she was with them. She started with the friends that were on Shan's route home, but branched out to others when no one said that they'd seen her. By 8 p.m, Shan's parents were out on the streets, walking the path that Shan would have taken, and then they made a discovery that turned their concerns into full-blown panic. In Pinaroo Park, which was the park just behind Shan's school, her parents found a bicycle lying abandoned on the side of a path. They knew right away that it was their daughter's because it was bright yellow, and they knew right away that something was awry. From there, they headed straight to the police station to file a missing persons report, and the police also took this case extremely seriously right from the get-go. By that time in the evening, it was getting late, but the police managed to speak with editors of a local newspaper and got Shan's picture put into the paper the next day, hoping that someone in the community would recognise the schoolgirl and know where she was. Many of the men on the police force had daughters around the same age as Shan, and the missing girl became a case close to their hearts, and the community responded in kindness. It was everyone's hope that the 12-year-old would be found alive and well, but as the days drew on, that hope dwindled, until on December 3rd, 1987, it shattered completely. Shan's body was found in the Tinbirwa Mountain State Forest, approximately 15 kilometres away from where she'd last been seen by witnesses at Pinaroo Park, and the police to this day are reluctant to speak about the condition in which they found her. Bob Dallow, the man who'd led the homicide investigation into Shan's case, also had little to say about it, but in an interview with the Courier Mail on the 25th anniversary of the day they found her, he said, quote, "When we found Shan, she had her shoes on and her pink socks, and I'll remember that for as long as I live. I think about her every day. She'd be 37 now. She'd have a family of her own by now. Her family has been robbed of that. Shan had been sexually assaulted, stabbed and strangled, and then abandoned in the forest to bleed out. The distressing discovery of her body shook not just her family and the community, but also the investigators, and the physical evidence found at the scene prompted them to chase leads the witnesses had given to them even harder. Some of the witnesses at Pinaroo Park and others scattered throughout the small community remembered seeing a white 1973 Holden Kingswood station wagon with interstate license plates near to the scene and on the streets at the time, but the police were already looking for that particular car, and at first it looked like it had nothing to do with Sian Kingi. On November the 11th, 1987, a woman named Cheryl Mortimer from Ipswich in Australia was on her way home from work where she was flagged down by a woman in a car. Cheryl pulled up to the woman's window, thinking that she was about to ask for directions to somewhere, but then a younger man sprung up beside Cheryl's car and held a knife to her throat. Cheryl struggled against him, desperately trying not to get caught by his knife as he tried to pull her out of the car, but the struggle made him catch himself with his own knife and he cut his hand. After that, the man gave up, jumping back into the other car as Cheryl's colleagues realised that she was in danger and rushed to the scene, and the other car took off, leaving Cheryl shaken but otherwise unharmed. She and her colleagues reported the incident to the police, giving the description of a white car with interstate license plates and providing the investigators with DNA evidence the younger man had left behind on Cheryl's car. Realising the two cases were connected, after witnesses described seeing a similar car at Pinaroo Park, investigators closed in and found out that the car was registered to a woman named Valmy Beck. Valmy Beck had a troubled start to life, being the youngest of 4 siblings and the only girl to a poor family. She began working at a clothing factory at the age of 12, and by 15 she was removed from her family home when Child Protective Services found both of her parents to be neglectful. She spent most of her youth in and out of jail. She'd been married 3 times, the first 2 leaving her with 6 children, but none of her children lived with her, and her third husband, John Barry Watts. John, who was more commonly known as Barry, was about 10 years younger than Valmy, but they had a lot in common with their troubled and difficult upbringings. Barry was an orphan who'd also been a ward of the state and been in and out of prison during his youth, and it was in Perth after coming out of prison on one occasion in 1983 that he met Valmy. 3 years later and they were married, but it didn't take long for troubles to begin to bubble under the surface of their relationship. Barry resented that Valmy had been in relationships before him, and he hated that she hadn't been a virgin when they'd married. Unable to change this and not wanting to lose her husband, Valmy began doing what she could to make Barry happy, and it's difficult to say exactly to what extremes she went to make that happen. We know that in 1995, Barry was tried for the murder of a woman called Helen Mary Feeney, just 1 month before the attack on Cheryl and Shan's murder. He was taken to court, but eventually acquitted due to lack of evidence. But perhaps it was this acquittal that made him bolder and would make him make the mistakes that led the investigators to his door. Barry wouldn't give up after Cheryl's botched attack and was actually suspected of a few others around the area when the police charged and arrested him and Valmy Beck for Shan's murder on December 15th, 1987. Barry remained stoic during the interrogations, but Valmy had a lot she wanted to get off her chest, and the investigators were more than willing to listen. She told the investigators how she'd been a disappointment to Barry and how he had fantasies that involved the assault of a young virgin. They'd first tried to find one for him in Ipswich before they'd noticed Shan on her bicycle that day, and Valmy called her over. She admitted that she'd told Shan that she needed help finding her lost dog. When Shan got off her bike to help Valmy look for it, Barry grabbed her from behind and threw her into the back of the car. He tied Shan up so that she couldn't fight back or escape, and then the couple drove her up to where she'd been found in the Timbirwa forest. Barry then lived out his twisted fantasies, and then, according to Valmy, he strangled and stabbed Shan before leaving her for dead. The investigators knew that they had their man, but looking at how Barry had just been acquitted in his last trial, they wanted to make sure that he wouldn't walk free for this one. An undercover officer went into Barry's cell, pretending to be his new cellmate. The officer bugged the room and lived with Barry for weeks, trying to piece together enough information about the case to make sure they could get Barry convicted even if he didn't confess. Matthew Heary described his time living with Barry Watts and said, quote, "Your basic instinct is to break their necks, but you can't. You never forget their faces. You work together to get the result, to get them off the street and make sure this doesn't happen again. But once you've got to that point and the adrenaline's gone, that's when all the thinking starts. It was hard because at the end of the day, nobody wanted to talk about it, but a lot of people cried about it. The police force back then, there was no safety net and absolutely zero support. If you felt hurt, you were less than a man." After getting what they needed to make sure that Barry was convicted of Shan's murder, Matthew Heary took 3 months off work before quitting the force for medical reasons at the age of 27. But thanks to him and the hard work of the other officers at the department, both Barry Watts and Valmy Beck were charged and sentenced for the abduction, rape, and murder of Sian Kingi, and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Whilst serving her sentence, Valmy Beck became a huge target for other inmates and was even at one point hit across the head with a can in a sock and was seriously injured. She had to be moved to a different correctional facility where she became a Christian and divorced Barry Watts, announcing that she regretted everything she'd ever done with him and everything she'd done for him. Despite her sentence, she still applied for parole and was rejected 3 times, but in 2008 she underwent heart surgery. She was put into a medically induced coma after the surgery, but her condition quickly turned bleak. She died without ever regaining consciousness and without ever speaking to investigators again. But Barry Watts is still alive and well, according to various news outlets. He went up for a review in 2009, but Alan Burke, a detective, senior constable at the time of Shan's murder, and other officers made it a point to be at Barry's hearing. He was denied parole and hasn't tried again, but Alan Burke has made it his mission to make sure that Barry Watts is never released. In an interview with the Courier Times, Burke said, quote, "I want to make sure enough pressure is brought to bear so that this guy is never released. No one should ever forget what this person has done to an innocent girl. If the community forgets, the more chance this guy has probably got of getting out. The tragedy does not end with Shan. It was only the beginning of something much worse, and that's having to live with the horror. If they'd still had a hanging knot, I would have quite happily hanged both of them. I still would.